Thank you for being here. Welcome to the 19th Annual Norman Williams Distinguished Lecture in Land Use Planning and the Law series. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm Dean of the Maverick Lloyd School for the Environment and Faculty Director of the Environmental Law Center. And a little bit about this lecture. It's a special lecture that we do every year named for Norman Williams. Norman Williams came to then Vermont Law School in 1975 after a long and distinguished career in public service and teaching, particularly in the area of land use. And so this lecture is always dedicated to topics in land use law. Professor Williams played a key role in founding Vermont Law School's Environmental Law Center. And the Norman Williams Distinguished Lecture in Land Use Planning and the Law series is a gift of Frances Yates, former trustee of Vermont Law School, in memory of both Norman Williams and Anya and Charles Yates of class 94 and 93. This lecture is hosted by the VLGS Environmental Law Center, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please hold your questions, make a note to yourself until then. And today we're very pleased to welcome Professor Sheila Foster. Professor Foster is the Scott K. Ginsburg Professor of Urban Law and Policy at Georgetown University. She also holds a joint appointment with the Georgetown Law Center in the McCourt Public Policy School. And this academic year, she's a visiting professor at Columbia University's Climate School. Professor Foster is a recognized authority on the role of cities and city leadership in promoting social and economic welfare, achieving environmental and climate justice, improving global governance, and addressing racial inequality. She's well known for her articles and books on environmental justice, including From the Ground Up, Environmental Racism and the Rise of the Environmental Justice Movement with Luke Cole, which I know was a very formative book for me early in my career, as well as the book The Law of Environmental Justice with Michael Gerard. Professor Foster has worked with government agencies and public officials on a range of issues, including environmental justice and climate policy. She was the chair of the Advisory Committee of the Global Parliament of Mayors from 2017 to 2020, and is a member of the New York City Mayor's Panel on Climate Change, where she co-chairs the work group on climate equity. She also co-directs LabGov, an international applied research project that has pioneered and nurtures the co-city approach through experimentation, multi-sector collaboration, assessment, and improvement. The co-city approach is set forth in her award-winning MIT Press book, Co-Cities: Innovative Transitions Toward Just and Self-Sustaining Communities. And LabGov projects applying the co-city methodology include places as diverse as Harlem, Baton Rouge, and Bologna, Italy. Her talk today is titled From the City as a Commons to the Co-City, Insights from a Decade of Study and Practice. Please join me in welcoming Professor Sheila Foster.
Is this on? Great. Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here. Vermont Law School holds a really special place in my heart. Has left an indelible impact on me, so it's really an honor to be here. So today what I thought I'd talk about is how I got from, or how I moved from a career focused on largely on environmental justice to a career that is focused on, one might say, urban development, urban planning, and cities, and as that field intersects with, I think, a host of other issues, including environment and climate justice. And I will hopefully show that it's a natural evolution of my work. And I start here because my first tenure track job actually was at Rutgers Camden. At that time, Rutgers had two law schools, one in Camden and one in Newark. They're now joined. But when I started my career, I had just started working on the book from the ground up with Luke Cole, and some residents in this neighborhood in Camden found out that I was teaching there and said, hey, you're an expert on this, we're having some problems. And this neighborhood and community became kind of emblematic of the kinds of communities that I've worked with now throughout my career, and this is why I'm starting here. And in some ways, the community is a classic example of a community that's facing environmental justice struggles. In the case of Camden, it's one of the poorest communities in the state. It's a post-industrial community. The particular area that's shown here and that suffered from a lot of environmental hazards and pollution is called the Waterfront South Arena. I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. Let's see if we can turn this off. Okay. And it's about less than 1 square mile, but like the rest of the city of the Camden, it's a pretty, it faces a lot of what I would call intersectional challenges. It's a food desert. When I was teaching there wasn't a grocery store in Camden. It's on the waterfront. It has a lot of polluting facilities. They live close to highways. There are so lots of environmental degradation. Their cancer and respiratory rates off the charts, and they had suffered from a decades-long population decline, and obviously from this picture here have a lot of blight or vacancy in the neighborhood. And of course, it goes without saying that unfortunately in this country, many of these communities are composed of racial and ethnic minority groups. But what I also discovered about this community and others like it is not, yes, they're beset with a lot of problems, a lot of poverty, a lot of environmental problems, but they also have a lot of assets. Shall we switch to, yeah, sorry about this, guys, I'm just gonna, there's a lot of feedback. Okay, can you hear me? Much better, great. That they also have a lot of assets that they use and leverage to improve their communities. Among them is what sociologists call social capital. I found that the bonds and relationships in the communities were very tight. They're often expressed through civic, religious, and other organizations. The group here, South Camden Citizens in Action, was formed as a grassroots organization to fight the pollution. We ended up actually bringing a civil rights lawsuit in federal court on their behalf and was quite successful in that for a moment, and then the Supreme Court overturned a part of what we won on 5 days later, but that's a whole other thing. They were able to bring residents, even the most marginalized residents, together to improve their neighborhood. And these were not experienced activists, right? These were just regular people working regular jobs, raising families. But again, we're trying to improve the neighborhood. And the upshot also is that not only did they have strong bonds, social capital, and were wanting to improve their community, but they were able to leverage these assets, including the vacant land in their community, into collective action. Action that not only, of course, reinforced those bonds and solidarity, but that helped them to create or produce new goods for themselves, right? Community gardens, as I think we all know about community gardens. Food, it can be a recreation space in communities that lack access to parks and green space. It can serve as eyes on the street, safety in neighborhoods that are facing crime. They can be safe spaces. And today we know that they also provide a host of climate benefits. The same communities that have been disinvested, were often redlined, are also our hottest places in the nation, and are also in flood zones. So here they were leveraging their assets, right, to produce all kinds of goods for themselves. And it enabled them to function and flourish in what I call a self-sustaining way. Now, just as a footnote, this is an environmental justice issue. The Environmental Justice Network in New York City actually brought a lawsuit in federal court against Mayor Giuliani back in the 90s because he wanted to do away with community gardens in neighborhoods like this all over the city to build housing, right? Not a bad trade-off if it's affordable housing, but without any process, et cetera. And environmental justice activists sued in federal court to help stop that. They weren't as successful, but one of the organizations that Bette Midler funded actually ended up buying up some of the gardens and saving them around New York City. And even in the hyper kind of one might say capitalist city that New York City is, you can see a lot of these gardens in neighborhoods like Harlem, like the South Bronx and South Brooklyn, et cetera. Okay, so around this time, I also discovered the work of Eleanor Ostrom. And for those of you who probably know, right, she's the first woman to win the Nobel in economics. And her work showed that something that I had already discovered, but I didn't know had a theory, that communities can govern not just themselves, but their shared resources, right? She, of course, looked at this in the natural environment. She found examples all over the world, especially in close-knit communities, of users cooperatively managing land, fisheries, forests, and that they were creating rules of use, how much fish you take out, right? How much you get from the forest in a way that sustained those resources, but also supported themselves. And where certain conditions, right, were observed, she found that their rules were respected and recognized by higher level authorities, right, usually national governments, and that the governance responsibilities of their communities and these resources sometimes were shared with other actors, sometimes with associations, water districts or associations, in this collaborative fashion, and were nested in some of those. And so in complex, systems, obviously the more complex and large the resource, the more this relationship with those other actors, like water districts, became important. And so this complexity mattered, right? So this was a revelation to me, not because it wasn't intuitive. It seemed intuitive to me because I had seen it, but the methodological approach that she had to actually going into these communities, studying them, and figuring out what works and what doesn't, turned out to become my path, as you will see, as I move towards what we call co-cities. Okay. So the next moment that brought me to where I am is that I, in the early 2000s, traveled with a number of environmental law professors here in the U.S., and we traveled around Latin America to look at the relationship between environmental regulation and urban development. Actually, that was the research focus of the trip. And in Bogota, Colombia, I had the opportunity to visit an informal settlement outside of Bogota, and as you know, in cities all over, in particular the global south, right? There are these informal communities. And the thing that struck me about these communities was that they were constructed or built without the participation directly of the local government or city, right? So in places like Bogota, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, Istanbul, et cetera, urban residents take an existing resource like open land, and whether it's legal or illegal squatting, that's a whole other question. And in a complex process involving many actors, they create and develop whole neighborhoods and cities, basically. And it involves several layers of improvisation and irregularity, which is why they're called irregular or informal settlements, and negotiation between many actors and agents involved in the process. So in talking to these residents and just seeing how developed these communities were, I learned a few things. Number one is that, wow, the state was always present, even though they weren't directly doing the building, in the way that they regulate, in the way that they legislate, and then write plans to try to pull these communities into local government urban planning. They often upgrade the infrastructure and sometimes are responsible for providing new infrastructure, such as transit. So this resonated with me because one of the things that I had after, or questions I had after Ostrom, is that what would this look like in an urban environment? What would, you know, the commons look like, these common pool resources that were self-governed by these communities look like in the urban environment? And so this struck me, and so one of the first papers that I wrote was called Informal Settlements as a Commons, as an Urban Commons. And so the experience with Ostrom and visiting these informal settlements in Latin American cities then made me realize that, you know, creating common goods from existing resources, right, and then sharing them and even self-governing or collectively governing them is happening in cities, right? What I've come to call constructed urban commons. And it's happening as a result of social processes of users coming together. Unlike in Ostrom's studies, right, these aren't always tight-knit communities. Some of them are, but literally some of them are heterogeneous strangers coming together. And what they're doing is that they're creating and sharing. It could be mesh networking that you see in places like Red Hook, Brooklyn, or in Berlin, and many different kind of cities where residents that lack stable internet access are kind of creating networks out of existing wired infrastructure. It could be co-housing, cooperatives, obviously we know, but also limited equity housing, and then, as I'll see later, or as we'll talk about later, land trust, community land trust. And today we have solar communities, right, and community solar. And so, again, often heterogeneous individuals and strangers engaged in what we've come to call social and economic pooling. And we use this term pooling as a riff on the technical term common pool resources, or a commons, which is what Eleanor Ostrom and others name it, because instead of the common pool resource existing like a fishery or a forest, these folks are creating the common pool resource through forms of economic and social pooling, through, again, wireless networks, housing, etc. So let's talk a bit about pooling, because this actually is important to the idea of the urban commons and to what we'll call co-cities. So more than pooling, we call them pooling economies. Why economies, right? Because it's challenging. One of the things about Ostrom in the city is that when you move from managing a natural resource which no one owns, and that's open access, literally the definition of a common pool resource, and that comes from the tragedy of the commons, right? The tragedy is that everyone can enter. You can't exclude anyone. It belongs to everyone. And we need some system of management, or else it will become degraded. Well, in this case, you know, that's not the case in urban environments. Urban Philadelphia and Los Angeles and construct. And what this does is moves them away from just being stakeholders in neighborhood development to being shareholders in their own revitalization and development in local economies, the very economies that they're helping to create. So that's partly what we mean by pooling economies. The other thing is that it can't just be community. So we have a place in the book where my co-author and I talk about, you know, it's not just about communities. Communities, we romanticize communities. Communities can't do broad-scale transformative change on their own. They do need to work with other actors. And the other thing that we found is that often in a lot of this kind of urban commoning and the creation of new forms of pooled, shared resources, we see the state. We see civil society organizations, usually community-based organizations, but they could be religious organizations. Universities are often present, local businesses and social innovators, right, in pooling across sectors. And this brings me to how I met my co-author, Christian Iaioni, who asked me to come to Bologna, Italy, because he had read my work on the urban commons and was involved in drafting what has become a historic piece of regulation in Bologna. Now, when someone asks you to come to Italy, there's no hesitation at all, right? And so I was happy to come to Bologna, Italy, and this is where we began to put some of these ideas. I had been writing about the urban commons, and he had been also starting to write and think about it. And Bologna is, between 2012 and 2014, I joined him to help draft and implement the Bologna regulation on collaboration between citizens in the city for the care and regeneration of the urban commons. This is a form of what we call public community partnerships, is kind of, and it should really be public community civic business partnerships in Bologna as it became, but at least this regulation is really about the collaboration between city government and these cities and these active citizenry or residents to activate themselves to help to care for and regenerate a host of resources, cultural assets such as green spaces, city-owned buildings, nurseries, housing, and how did this regulation do that? Well, it did it in a number of ways. So the core of the regulation were these pacts of collaboration in which the local administration, the government, could agree with a mix of residents or NGOs, representative civic groups, foundations, or businesses through a co-design process. So one of the things that Bologna did was they set up these neighborhood governance labs. And the neighborhood governance labs were designed to identify areas of intervention. So one of the migrant communities in Bologna that lived in what's called public or social housing wanted to make that housing into more of a community for them, right? In which they weren't just blocks of housing, but there were spaces for them to interact, to improve the housing themselves. That could be the subject and was the subject of a pact. A group of parents in a neighborhood and other residents wanted to regenerate a nursery school that was no longer operating. So the city would enter into these pacts, now over 600 signed today, based on these fieldwork activities, these neighborhood governance labs, these co-design process, and then transfer to them, eventually setting up a separate office called Civic Imagination, transferring to them the resources that they needed. It could be money, it could be materials, et cetera, and in a way that could result in, again, co-constructed, co-generated care of the urban environment in this kind of partnership. This experiment won the inaugural Bloomberg Cities in Service Award. Afterwards, a number of cities, first around Italy and Europe, began to copy the regulation. We were against that because we don't believe in copy and paste, but nevertheless, it was a great experiment. We have some critiques about how it was implemented, but I'm happy to answer that. So public-community partnerships, that is to say that working across sectors or public, community, private, civic partnerships are one of the ways that pooling economies get formalized, that law and public policy helps to foment those partnerships to allow the construction of these goods. The other insight that we came to have is that it wasn't just about these partnerships, right? It wasn't just working with communities, it was really putting communities in charge, that a lot of these resources, and this is back to Ostrom's work, right? A lot of this is about who stewards the resource over time, who gets to decide, and we realize that a lot of kinds of urban commons, one of the things that they had in common was actual governance. right? Collective governance. It's a key feature of the collaborative construction of many pooled resource institutions or resources. And community land trusts, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard of, embody this, right? They're on the rise today in urban environments like they never were before. And that wasn't the case when we started looking at this. But CLTs have a tripartite governing structure, again, reflecting this public-private, community partnership. They have community members, they have users and residents who are living on the land trust or either taking advantage of the land use of the land trust, and then others that are involved in those efforts. For instance, it's a form of stewardship, right? A form of governance, meaning in this context, stewardship doesn't just mean kind of making decisions about what happens, who's in and who's out, but it also is to maintain, in this case, affordability and accessibility for future generations. But also it takes it off the market. So it's a really thick form of stewardship that we're talking about. It takes it off the market in order to steward the resource and hold it affordable for future generations and to help often keep communities in place. And this was, and some of you probably know this example, was the case with the Dudley Street Community Land Trust, one of the longest running, most sustainable and successful community land trusts at scale. You might see a community land trust in one particular place around an affordable housing a set of apartments or even a commercial use, but in Dudley, they actually put an entire urban village right in a land trust. And how did they do this? So this was the Boston areas in the 1980s, and Dudley was one of the poorest areas of Boston. And neighborhood residents, through a civic organization, the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, worked with city and state officials to acquire acres and acres of lots that were under the city's control, but also lots that were privately owned, but that had abandoned or been tax foreclosed, and the state lent its eminent domain power to the group, which under Massachusetts law you can do. And all of these lots were assembled and placed in the community land trusts, and it was funded by state money, private philanthropy, I think Ford, et cetera, and they created this urban village in which they have more than 225 affordable homes, including cooperative limited equity housing. Most of the housing units are targeted for families making between 30 and 60% of the area's median income, which equals to about 30 to 60,000 a year for a family of four. They have a 10,000 square foot community greenhouse. They have 2 acres of community farms, playgrounds, gardens, commercial space, and other amenities of a thriving urban village for themselves. And during the foreclosure crisis, in the 1990s, not one home was lost to foreclosure. So it's a successful, sustainable model. Importantly, it's also democratically governed. The CLT, the board has 35 seats, 20 of which are reserved for community residents that include 4 main ethnic groups that have a proportional share of seats on the board. And the remaining seats are for community development organizations, local religious organizations, partner organizations, and 2 for small businesses. So again, this is my kind of revelation step by step. This also brought me to something I wrote about in a 2011 piece called Collective Action in the Urban Commons, about the importance of enabling environments, to not just creating a community garden, a shared resource, or to creating a collaborative co-design process, as in Bologna with these labs, but to creating what Eleanor Ostrom or the Ostroms, her husband Vincent Ostrom, who was a political scientist, called a polycentric environment of, again, where you have enabling institutions, policies, and laws, and you have scale like a city and complexity. You need an environment that enables the flourishing of a lot of these types of urban commons, of constructed, co-created, co-designed, and then stewarded collective institutions that are producing and stewarding goods and services that serve the most, in my case, marginalized communities. Sometimes these activities are nested in higher level institutions, I'll talk about, but even if they're flourishing, right, around the city, it unlocks what Ostrom talked about as public entrepreneurship, right? She says that polycentric systems can open the public sector to innovation in providing, producing, and encouraging the collective governance of essential goods and services at the local level without privatizing these goods and services. So, today what we see, local and government enabling in New York City. I'll just talk through these examples quickly. Increasingly, we see cities like New York, Seattle, Los Angeles, et cetera, and other cities stepping into the enabling environment. New York is, I think we'll see more of this, but what New York has done is agreed to, through its housing department, transfer. Even the most successful cities like New York have lots of vacant land. Sometimes they have land banks where they just hold it, like the city where I was born in Detroit, and they residents in communities that need investment and revitalization want to use these lots. But cities often are very stingy. They think they're waiting for developers to come along. So what would happen if we transferred some of this land, which I think is in the commons, to enable communities to use them? New York said, we'll do that. We'll give you money to plan new community land trusts. They created a learning collaboratory to build the capacity, kind of like a lab, to start a CLT to allow residents to be able to do this, to increase their capacity. They created a director of CLT initiatives at the housing agency. And as a result, we see a number of these flourishing and coming in, or starting up in New York City. I want to give an example of another enabling model, what I would call nested, again, using Ostrom's terms, nested urban commons. This is NeighborSpace in Chicago. NeighborSpace is a urban land trust. It's not a community land trust, but it's an urban land trust whose goal is to preserve community gardens and open spaces that are already being utilized by communities, like as in gardens or urban farms or urban agriculture. And they wanted to protect these and preserve these in places where this open space is either lacking or vanishing, and a lot of these are in underserved areas. So 3 local governments in Chicago, which are the City of Chicago, the City Park District, and the Forest Preserve District of Cook County, came together, worked with community leaders, residents, and NGOs, and to identify parts of the cities that had these lots, and where community groups were already trying to steward the land, and they created this land trust. What does the land trust do? They give land grants for the land to the community. Once the land grant is established, they relinquish operational control, which in itself, and transfers that control to the communities that are governing or that are working on that land. And those groups act as stewards of the land, and the rules of the land trust says it can't just be one steward. It has to be a collection. It has to be a collective group. So in effect, NeighborSpace operates as a higher level authority, while the real control and stewardship of the day-to-day is at the neighborhood and at the lot level. It also clears any permits if you're going to garden in the city. Again, the city is a thick regulatory environment. Very hard to do this without the city sharing power and allowing the water to be turned on or rezoning a lot, et cetera. So to transfer land, to give equipment, to also give them the enabling tools they need to create and steward and maintain all of the resources that they're using. And so this is an example of what, again, Eleanor Ostrom called nested, because if you're doing this at scale, and it's not just one lot or even a neighborhood, it's a city, sometimes you have to nest these, right, in a larger infrastructure. Okay. So these insights brought myself and then my co-author to create this framework, which we published in the Yale Journal of Law and Policy, called The City as a Commons. Really using Ostrom's insights, rooting them in the city, talking about the ways in which property law and regulation and zoning, et cetera, interact with the commons in a way that necessitates thinking about this form of land stewardship and land control and community control very differently in a city than it would be in the resources where Ostrom worked. And here was born what we call our Co-Cities project, right? What I would call mapping and learning. And this is an empirical project investigation that we launched. It's now, so it's an old map. It's our original map of 100 cities. Now we've studied over 200 cities and over 500 cases, either examples or policies, in which people and or governments and others are trying to collectively create and maintain resources at the hyper-local level. And sometimes they're nested, sometimes they're not. But nevertheless, this is a learning exercise. We identified case studies for every geographical area: Southern Europe, Central and Northern Europe, Eastern Europe, North America, Central America, Latin America, North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Asia, Oceania, et cetera, in order to capture diversity. And in the book Co-Cities, we have a list in our appendix of all of these, and there's a website called commoning.city in which you can look at the map and also include your own case study. And what we did, much as Ostrom did, is that we extracted some design principles, right? One of the impactful ways that Ostrom came to this, or left a legacy in which there's a whole international association for the study of the commons, researchers all over the world that are continuing her legacy, in part because she laid down a set of design principles for where does this work. So this is our kind of version 1.0 from our empirical investigation. We saw a lot of things I've talked about, that in a lot of these examples, there was collective governance. There were groups of people coming together, pooling. There were pooling economies. There was an enabling state. A lot of these were experimental, just like Bologna was. So for example, in Bologna, we went back and looked at the pacts and how they were put in place as a way to try to figure out whether that experiment was working in the way that it was intended to be. And something that surprises is what we came to name tech justice, but is the importance of actually technology in enabling a lot of these constructed and stewarded resources over time. And that these became the design principles that we said, if you want to do this at scale in a city, these are the things that we see are often present. We also, because we began to work in certain cities, and I'll end my talk with talking about Harlem and Baton Rouge, where I brought these co-city projects, we also thought about how do you practice this? How do you put this into practice? And so this is what we call our co-city cycle. You know, you come into a community, you want to do something like this. What does that entail? The first, I'll just talk about the parts of the cycle. Cheap talking, which is an Ostrom term. I mean, it sounds horrible, but actually what she meant is low-stakes talking, which is to say that informal, pressure-free communication among the key local actors, right? The social entrepreneurs, the city or an agency in the city, civic organizations, et cetera, to activate the community who will be involved in the collaborative project. Mapping is the next step in the cycle, which involves understanding the local context, in particular the neighborhood context, sometimes through surveys, sometimes through exploratory interviews, field work, ethnographic work. Third is what we call practicing, which is really trust building. Sometimes this takes the form of a collaboration day, a collaboration camp, a placemaking events that brings people together and tries to get a quick win, creating a garden, a community garden, so that actors begin to trust each other. And then prototyping, which is co-designing the specific policy. It could be a pact or a regulation, as in Bologna, or an institutional mechanism like a CLT, to address the challenges that we've mapped out and identified. Phase 5 is testing, which is actually putting the prototype in place, creating the CLT, drafting the regulation, and then allowing it to stand up and get running. And then modeling involves going back after a while, which is what we did in Bologna, to see if it's working, and if it's not, how do you tweak it and make sure it works. So this is what we call the kind of practice cycle. And then on the right, you probably can't see that, and I'm sorry about that, but it's what we call Co-City tools, and all this can be found on, I have a website called labgovus.com, so all these images can be found there, which are the recurring legal, financial, institutional, and digital technological tools that we have found work in other places, but also ones that we put in place ourselves. And they could be civic use policies, public collaboratories, crowdfunding, social impact financing, university labs, all of the things that we have seen work to create this kind of polycentric environment in cities that allow communities to be self-sustaining and also to be stewards of their own revitalization. Okay, so in the last part of the talk, I want to use 5 minutes to talk about how I've landed this in the communities that I work in. Starting with Harlem. We got an NSF grant to put in place an edge cloud network in Harlem because, remarkably, in a smart city, 1 in 3 residents in Harlem and in northern Manhattan don't have access in their home to high-speed internet. A number of businesses, schools, et cetera, don't have access. So we needed to overcome that lack of access, overcome legacy infrastructures, outdated legal arrangements. And so we began to work with the city and a community partner to put this in place with a lot of researchers at different universities. Microsoft ended up donating dozens of edge cloud servers. And so here's an edge cloud, how an edge cloud works, which is nodes in different parts of Harlem that are their own cloud. The cloud's not up there, it's actually in your building, and it gives people a way to govern their own digital resource and to also do it at highly secure and lower cost. So it's a community network as a digital constructed common resource, which became a groundbreaking model for how to think about distributed community commons in a highly technical digital context that equitably provides benefits and that are transferable to other communities, that integrates diverse stakeholders' perspectives into the co-design and edge cloud computing process, and also that actually has become nested in the larger New York City's 5G testbed. And here's just an example of the co-city cycle that we went through in this process, including informal meetings in NYCHA housing and public housing, many convenings, working with the city, mapping where the lack of access was and where the servers would go, engaging in technology trials and community working sessions and how we would govern this entity, prototyping the governance arrangements, and then we're in a period, or rather Silicon Harlem has been in a period of testing. So that was one of the first projects that I applied this to, with mixed results, I must say. The one that's currently going on is what we call Co-City Baton Rouge, and the part of Baton Rouge we're working in on the right is called Plank Road. It's North Baton Rouge, very close to Cancer Alley, if you've heard that. And all of the dots are all of the kind of vacant land that are in the community that are under the control of the city and of the redevelopment authority. So they ask us in to work with the community that had already identified in a master plan what was important to them, amplify their culture, history, and neighborhood institutions, protect and grow community wealth, build streets and neighborhoods that connect people to opportunities. And again, Plank Road used to be a thriving African-American commercial area. It's now in a city that's heavily stratified by race and class, and it is literally an infrastructure desert, inconsistent sidewalks, inconsistent streetlights, lots of vacancy, et cetera. So one of the things that we prototyped there with the community was the creation of the first ever in the country combined community land bank and land trust. Why combined? I talk about land banks, cities as Baton Rouge usually have them to hold property without development. And in Louisiana, the property law is complicated. If someone abandons their property, it has to be adjudicated, and that process can take 10 to 15 years. And so the city was holding this until those titles cleared, holding a lot of land. And then a land trust would develop the land into goods that the community needs, affordable housing, green space, et cetera. So we created this land bank, community land bank and land trust hybrid so that the city could transfer lots of land into this entity that could stay there until title cleared, but the community knew they had it. And then also a governance structure and a institution to attract financing so that we can begin to develop some of the things that the community need. And so what's going to be developed? They identified the food hub, a food incubator, again, it's a food desert, and a pocket park, which we now call an eco park, to address their lack of green space, their need for safe space, their need for a safe bus stop, and to deal with flooding. And so the first development is underway, the Eco Park, in which we went through a co-design process and a competition during COVID, by the way, with the community, largely online, with the local university, with the city, with a lot of, by pooling a number of people, and they were able to identify all of the elements that they needed in this park. And we got the city park agency to sponsor it, and obviously the land is in the land bank and land trust, it's vacant land, and this will be the first thing. And here's again the Co-City process. The cheap talking phase was a food truck roundup because food is very important there. So bringing people together around selling their food. And then again, design charrettes, a competition, a design competition for prototyping, and then a testing phase where we had to figure out which lots would be used. And as a result, we, in a collaborative with others down there, won a $5 million JP Morgan Chase Advancing Cities grant to put this in place. And some of the other things that, they'd like to see down there are a grocery store, affordable housing, and a cultural center. So these are the two ways or projects that, coming back to the kind of communities that I started in, I wanted to bring all of these insights and practice into. So just to close, these are illustrative examples, I think, of the idea of how the commons, or rather collectively constructed, co-created, community-driven, and stewarded goods and services can emerge even in the most marginalized communities and can be sustained over time, supported and enabled by public officials, by public agencies, the private sector, nonprofit organizations, and universities often. And despite its name, co-cities aren't just for cities, I think. I think you can, this approach can be adaptable to many places where there are communities and enablers. Most importantly, I think the government. And through public community and sometimes public-private community civic knowledge partnerships, these multi-sector collaborations have, I think, the opportunity and the potential to spur what I call collaborative economies and move us away from development in which communities are merely a voice or stakeholders to where they are true shareholders in a society that often leaves them out. And so with that, I hope that this vision of co-cities is one that is motivating and that I've explained how it can work and also where my inspiration comes from. And so I look forward to your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Foster. It was such an interesting presentation. We do have time for some questions. So if anyone is interested in asking a question, just raise your hand and Courtney will bring the microphone to you. And I see we already have one over here.
Hello. Yes. Hi, I'm Carlson with the Institute for Energy and the Environment. Appreciated so much about your presentation. One of the questions that I had, got a former client that's doing a lot of cooperative development in the Southeast, whether there's examples in the South that are going this direction, and also just interested in like how to get a critical mass upon startup and then scaling, like what those processes are like.
A critical mass of people, you mean in a particular place that want to do something?
People and also assets like capital and
Yeah, very good. In the Southeast, absolutely. You could talk about the blue cities. Plenty of this is happening in blue cities, right? But I don't think that may be what you're asking about. But for sure, some cities, even like Atlanta, like Houston, have city land trust. They're not community land trusts, but they're city land trusts. Some communities, like Atlanta and others that are building belt lines around the city and in marginalized neighborhoods, are trying to put in place some of these institutions to lock in affordability and to avoid gentrification, because they know once they put in these amenities that it will attract, and so we see this all over the place, right? I call it climate gentrification, green gentrification, but they'll attract higher income folks to those neighborhoods, displacing. So what we see is that these models are beginning to take root as a way to manage extractive development, basically. I don't think, and then we have a place like Jackson, Mississippi, right, in which the state is absolutely hostile, right, to the poorest residents in Jackson. They've got more of a ground-up approach. There's a group called Cooperation Jackson. It's a Black-led group that is doing a lot of this work in the city, sometimes in competition. I mean, the city has a mayor, but as any of you law students who know, who take state and local government, you know, in places like that, the mayor lacks a lot of power. So they are trying to do this bottom up with the mayor, but against, I think, a lot more pushback. So it is happening in the Southeast. And if you go place by place, how do you get a critical mass of people doing this? Spread the word and try and figure out how to root it in communities. I think the hardest thing is finding the opening to do this work in a community that needs to do it but doesn't know where to start and whether they'll be able to create an enabling environment. I do think you need an enabling environment. Sometimes it's one person in one agency in a city that's willing. So we're in Baton Rouge. This is not a blue city or state, frankly. I mean, but it took the redevelopment agency and the head of that to say, the urban planning and urban renewal and the history of urban development here has a really negative history, and I want to try to change that for people and do things differently. So sometimes it's just one person, and then you can, bring people around that effort.
Hi, my name is Nicole, and thank you so much for being here and sharing your research with us. This is fascinating. My question is a little bit more on the technical side, specifically between, I believe, phase 4 and phase 5, the prototyping and the testing. And I'm wondering, in your research and in your insight into that research, what the best amount of time is to wait to see how the prototype phase is taking off, and then but basically the amount of time, is it based on size of community or entrenchedness of a community, and is there a consistent moment of time where it's best to go back and reevaluate?
So that's a really good question, and I think it depends. Like, so in Bologna, it was the time to put the regulation in place and begin to sign the pacts of collaboration, and then to get them to operate. Just have to wait for that process. So I think we went back 3 years after it was put in place, and because we pulled 180 some pacts, and then we're able to interview people. In Baton Rouge, because of the pandemic and other, to even stand up the Community Land Bank and Trust took a long time. And it took an even longer time to bring resources to get the permits to build the park. Sometimes you just have to wait until there's enough in place where you can see, and we still don't know. Actually, we can't go back now because we're trying to raise capital, we're trying to raise money, we're trying to get social impact investment into the area to transform the area by using the CLBT as a catalyst. That's going to take a while. So these are, because government is slow, that's number one. And number two, these are communities that have been disinvested for so long that nothing's going to happen quickly, but something you can have quick wins, and you can start to increase the capacity of the community to be really engaged in governance over time and stewardship by bringing them along in the process. And that does take a while. Okay, I'll keep my answers much shorter. There are lots of.
Good evening. My name is Janice. Thank you for being here with us and sharing your story. I'm curious, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it sounds like it's a widely applicable model and it's very hopeful also. And I was wondering, are there any factors that make it almost impossible to apply, or is it always just a almost tedious, but you can always make it type of situation?
So that's a good question. It is hopeful because I think there is a lot that we can do by using the insights of Ostrom and others, but it is also very hard to do. It's very hard, and there will be failures along the way. That's why one of our principles was experimentalism. You have to be willing to experiment and fail and learn and go on. And I don't know if the Harlem Project is a success or failure, actually. I think we're still seeing that. And it may not be able to be applied everywhere. So I don't like to be romantic about this stuff, so I would say it's a model. There are other models. We're trying to see how well it works.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for this presentation. My name is Fran Miller, and I work here at the Center for Agriculture and Food Systems. And I work on land access, and I do a lot of work on community land trusts and commons and all of what you're talking about. I'm from New York City, and so the Harlem Project was really interesting to me, and I wondered both, who came up with the broadband idea? Like, did that come from the community, or was it more imposed? And also, I wondered more broadly, what are those failures, barriers? Because this work is so hard.
It is, yeah.
And we're challenging individualistic ideology that's really strong in America, even though there's also this really strong community ideology and connection. So I wondered how that.
So that's a good question because it allows me to add one other dimension. When I go into communities, I always say I find the anchor institutions. And we work with an anchor institution called Silicon Harlem. Silicon Harlem's already in the community. They're of the community. They convene the community. And anchor institutions, first and foremost, have convening power. So when we say community, we romanticize it. How do we go and get the community? Well, who are you going to talk to? Where are you going to start? Thousands, sometimes millions of people. Anchor institutions are important. They wanted to do this because they saw the gap, and they also, yes, we're individualized, but a lot of the folks in these communities can't afford what we're paying for broadband access. And then they may not be able to afford laptops. They're in schools without laptops. So this was the Silicon Harlem folks. And then when they began to call hundreds of people out to their meetings to talk about this, people were excited about this once they learned about it. What are the failures? The failure is it's not clear to me that the collective governance part of this works with this kind of highly technical experiment. Silicon Harlem's basically the governance, and all of the edge clouds, instead of being spread around, are kind of with them because it was too complicated to put them in. So So we'll see, but there's still a community advisory board. There's some pieces of it there, but the thing we prototyped and the thing that got put in place and then implemented once we all went away, because that's the other thing. You come into these communities I like to say I leave something behind so when we walk away, it can still be stewarded. Now they're stewarding it, and I think we need to at some point go back and see whether it's working.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you for your presentation. This is somewhat of a follow-up question to a lot of the questions asked, which is, you mentioned the word gentrification. And personally, I have a background with urban issues, and it's been my experience that it seems there's a great climate of fear and a lack of imagination. And I wanted, in your personal experience, how have you been able to bridge and communicate that just because we're changing the status quo doesn't mean everything's going to fall apart necessarily?
Yes, so I think the question you're asking is that, and I think even with this model, people may still see gentrification risk, right? But I work with people like We Act in Harlem, West Harlem Environmental Action, and one of the things that the head of We Act, Peggy Shepard, who is called the godmother of environmental justice, said to me, we're not against gentrification, we're against displacement, right? Because we want good things in our communities too. And they have a climate action plan that is all about the transition, that has things like the land trust that aims a microgrid using the solar power from a city building. I think these communities, we say local innovators or social entrepreneurs because they're in these communities, they have these ideas, and they need help figuring out, or assistance, partners to figure out how to take the best of what they've already been thinking about. So we're not bringing anything new to these communities, but we are enabling them and put it in place in a way that doesn't come back to bite them, right? Non-extractive models. And so I feel like my role and my team's role and the people I collaborate with in many places are there to help figure that out, right? In the context in which the community is in, legal context, cultural context, social, and economic. And that looks differently. That's why it's a prototype. A CLT is not going to work in place. The Bologna regulation is not going to work in every place, right? So I'm starting to work in LA in a park called Leimert Park, which is a historical, that's going to look totally different, right? They've already got a CLT, but they're trying to do other stuff, like a neighborhood investment trust and other things that allow a black community to build itself, not lose itself, get ready for the Olympics. There's a new metro style. There's a lot going on there, right? So I feel like I come in to bring a model and to say, and they said, we keep hearing this can't be done, and you're the first person to say, yes, it can. We just need to be creative about this. So yeah, there's fear, but there's also people and lawyers, law schools and master's program. Like I feel like this is what we should be doing. We should be taking these incredible tools and thinking outside the box. I know we're out of time.
Yeah, I'm sure we could sit here with you for another hour or so, but unfortunately we're out of time. Thank you so much to everybody who joined us today in person and online. And thank you so much, Professor Foster, for your presentation. It's been a joy to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much.